I'm Matt Hutcheson, Product Manager for Seed Consultants, and today we want to talk about what we can do scouting our cornfields now, what we can do to help us make better decisions next year, especially focusing on the management practices that are under the control of the farmer. So we're going to talk today about some things like planting depth, plant spacing, hybrid selection, things that you can do based on what you're observing in your field right now that can help you make better decisions in the future. So one thing that we've run into this year is a lot of concerns, a lot of calls with issues relating to planting depth. So I really like to stress the importance of planting depth, that at a minimum your corn should be at 1.5 inches, and a lot of times I think there's a misconception that someone will hold their finger and say, well, that's 1.5 inches, and they're not actually deep enough. And really need to make sure you're getting to that 1.5 inch depth or lower, where we see problems with yield, with crop development, emergence, a lot of issues at shallow planting depths. And where you get to your 1.5 inches to 2 or 2.5, there's studies and yield data out there that show there's a lot more consistency. So better yields, more consistent emergence, and more consistent ear set. So that's one thing we want to talk about today, is how we can evaluate our planting depth and our stand and go from there. So we've got some runt plants in this field. Every so often we kind of cut away the rows here, but you can see this plant clearly came up very late, much later than all the others, and is basically a weed at this point. And there's a few every now and then in the field. So we dug a few up, and we've got some planting depth issues with these. We've also got some compaction. You can see here this root system did not penetrate. The seed was not planted very deep to begin with, and then the roots didn't penetrate well either. So we got multiple issues going on there, but a stunted plant that's not going to put on any kind of an ear. It's basically a weed as a result of a shallow planting depth. And then another stunted plant is probably more of a compaction issue, but wanted to show it to you anyway. You can see the roots are pretty much flat on this one side, where you can see there was sidewall compaction of the seed trench. They didn't really branch out much. And that's an issue that we see when we do field work and plant under wetter conditions. When we go back to this row here, one thing that's really critical when we talk about what can we do to improve our yields next year, there's two big things that are critical at planting, and that's emergence, uniform emergence, and uniform stands, or what sometimes are referred to as picket fence stands. So you can go out now in your field and take a look at some of these issues and figure out if you need to try to adjust them. But one thing you can look for is first the spacing. When you look at plants that are pretty well spaced equally, and then you see a large gap, a lot of times, especially on your semi-flex to flex type hybrids, you'll see a much bigger ear. And so this leads to the thought that, well, maybe I can just back off my populations and I'll have fewer plants and a lot of flex ears out there. And in some cases you can do that with hybrids. You can moderate your populations, but when you have a gap this big, your flex ear is not going to make up for that missing plant. So something to keep in mind, you want to make sure your populations are at the right level for your yield levels and your soil type, and that you're not leaving large gaps and hoping to rely on the flex of the hybrid only to make up for those gaps. Another thing that you can look at is these runt plants. We've got one here in this shot. We've seen another and a couple others in this row, but why do we have this plant that's behind the others? And if it's an emergence issue due to planting depth, try to dig it up and find the seed. Sometimes you can still see the seed coat in the root system. We were unable to find that today, but if you dig up the seed, dig up the plant, get the dirt away from the root system, you can clip back these roots, and sometimes you can find the seed coat and you can determine how deep you were planted. But if we were at a shallow planting depth, not far enough in to get moisture with this one, and then these 2 or 3 over here were deep enough and they got out of the ground ahead of this later emerging one that was too shallow, there's an issue right there that we can fix with planting depth. We can also look for skips, whether it's just a run plant or if you just have skips, maybe you need to go back to doing some maintenance or adjusting on your planter. These are all things that are under our control as farmers or agronomists, as producers. There's a lot of things in the growing season we can't control, but we can work harder to improve our planting depth and our emergence and our stands to hopefully improve our yields in the future.